Hi guys, welcome back. And for the next part of the lesson, we're going to take a look at the hormones that are in charge of our reproductive systems. And we're going to take a look at both the male reproductive system first, and then we're going to finish up with the female reproductive system. So let's start by talking about the male reproductive hormones. So, of course, the main male reproductive hormone is testosterone. Testosterone is usually referred to as the male sex hormone. It is an androgen, which means that it is a type of steroid or a lipid hormone, and it is essentially responsible for all the male secondary sexual characteristics that a young boy will start to develop after puberty. So, all those characteristics that we associate with being male, usually extra facial hair, body hair, development of the male sex organs, higher muscle mass, higher bone density, higher energy levels, more stamina, and so on. All of those are a result of testosterone production. Testosterone also is partly responsible for sperm production as well. Testosterone is not the only male reproductive hormone. We're going to take a look at how different hormones interact with each other in order to both stimulate the production of testosterone, which will in turn stimulate the production of the secondary sex characteristics, as well as stimulate sperm production. At some point, a young boy is going to start puberty, and the initial stimulus for the onset of that is going to be the release of a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone by the hypothalamus in the brain, GnRH for short. And GnRH is going to move not very far, is going to move into the pituitary gland that is right below it. And at the pituitary gland is going to stimulate the production of two other hormones. And the two hormones are luteinizing hormone, or LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. Now, both of these have different effects on different cells within the testes. So, LH, or luteinizing hormone, is going to go to the testes and stimulate a particular type of cell called Leydig cells. And these cells are going to produce testosterone. Follicle stimulating hormone, it's going to go to another type of cell called the Sertoli cells in the testes, and these cells are going to be stimulated by both the presence of follicle stimulating hormone and testosterone. Both of these together are going to stimulate the production of sperm, or the maturation of sperm, by these particular cells. And so that's the male reproductive system right there, at least the part that is the stimulation. GnRH will be secreted by the hypothalamus into the pituitary gland, where it will stimulate the production of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone will move on to the testes. At the testes, luteinizing hormone will stimulate a particular type of cell so that it can secrete testosterone. Follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate another type of cell so that it can start sperm production. But in order for sperm production to really begin, those cells need to be stimulated by both FSH and testosterone together. Now, when testosterone levels get high enough, testosterone levels are going to be regulated by the presence of testosterone itself. So testosterone levels will inhibit GnRH production by the hypothalamus, which in turn will inhibit luteinizing hormone and FSH production by the pituitary gland, which will then in turn inhibit testosterone production. So testosterone production inhibits its own production. And that's a way by which the male body can control and regulate testosterone levels in the blood. When testosterone levels get too high, it inhibits GnRH production, which in turn will then inhibit its own production, which is the reason why when males inject themselves with anabolic steroids, then their own testosterone production will drop. If the body is detecting androgens or testosterone that comes from the outside, it essentially inhibits the production of its own testosterone. Okay, so next let's take a look at the female reproductive hormones, and of course we'll start with estrogen, which is the main female sex hormone. Also, like testosterone, is a steroid hormone. It is produced by the ovaries, and it is responsible for the female secondary sexual characteristics, so breast development, as well as some other characteristics, including the maintenance of bone density, which is the reason why women who undergo menopause are going to have reduced bone density and be more prone to osteoporosis. Another thing that estrogen does is it actually maintains hair follicles. So this is the reason why women after menopause as well, one of the unfortunate side effects of lack of estrogen after menopause is your hair starts to fall out a little bit more. And so a lot of different effects can be part of just estrogen production. It also obviously stimulates the growth of the uterine lining, which is responsible for feeding an embryo once it gets implanted. So, in preparation for fertilization and for pregnancy. And a peak in estrogen mid-cycle is what actually stimulates the secretion of another hormone, which causes ovulation. So estrogen is not responsible directly for ovulation, but peaks in estrogen levels are indirectly responsible for ovulation. And there's several hormones that interact with each other. But another main hormone involved is progesterone. And progesterone is produced also by the ovaries. It is also a steroid hormone, and it also stimulates the uterine lining and stimulates its growth and development and prevents contractions, which means that it maintains pregnancy. So progesterone is one of the main hormones during pregnancy. And an absence of progesterone triggers menstruation. So we will see in a minute when we look at hormone levels, it is actually the drop in progesterone levels, which in turn leads to menstruation because the uterine lining can no longer be maintained. So when we're taking a look at the female reproductive hormones, you can see that the process is very complicated. There's a lot of arrows here. You will have some red arrows, some green arrows, and some blue arrows here, and that can be a little confusing. So for the purposes of the flowchart I'm going to give you, the green arrows are going to represent stimulation of an effect, and we're going to use red arrows for inhibition, and we're going to go through it step by step. The thing that makes it complicated when we take a look at the female reproductive hormones is that we're looking at three things at once. We're looking at what's happening to hormones. We're also looking at what's happening to the ovary and ovulation, and we're also looking at what's happening to the uterus and menstruation. So there's several things that we have to kind of keep track of, but let's do this and let's do that step by step so that you can better understand the whole process of hormone production and menstruation and ovulation in females. So let's begin. During those first few days, we're going to start with menstruation and the decline of the uterine lining. And then with gonadotropin releasing hormone released by the hypothalamus, GnRH. GnRH is going to then stimulate, in this case, just one hormone to begin with from the pituitary gland, and that is follicle stimulating hormone. So GnRH or gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to move from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland and stimulate the secretion of follicle stimulating hormone. Now, follicle stimulating hormone does the job that the name implies. It stimulates the development of a follicle at the ovary. What is a follicle? Well, essentially, the ovary is full of eggs, but the eggs are not yet matured. Remember from grade 11, you learn about meiosis. And I don't know if you remember learning that a baby girl is born with every egg that she will ever produce in her lifetime in her ovaries, but developed only up to the prophase 1 stage of meiosis. So once a month after puberty, one of her eggs is going to continue through the process of meiosis, and eventually the egg is going to be produced. And so the follicle is essentially almost like a little blister that forms in an ovary. And within that blister, the maturing egg will be found. So every single month, either the right or the left ovary will have one of its eggs mature inside a follicle. And the follicle is actually very active because the follicle, as it matures, it develops these cells that are going to produce estrogen. So estrogen is actually produced by the follicle cells that are developed at the ovary. So notice on the section of the diagram labeled D that levels of estrogen are increasing over the follicular phase. And that is because as the follicle develops, estrogen levels are increasing because the follicle is producing and releasing estrogen. The estrogen moves into the uterus and starts the development of what is called the endometrium, which is the uterine lining. And so within the uterus, there will be a very blood-rich and nutrient-rich lining that will form on the inside of the uterus in preparation for fertilization and pregnancy. And estrogen produced by the follicles will go to the uterus and start the development of that uterine lining in preparation for a pregnancy that might occur during that particular cycle. As the follicle starts to produce estrogen, estrogen levels in the blood will increase. And once estrogen levels get to a certain levels, estrogen will then stimulate the pituitary gland to produce luteinizing hormone. And so this is a time thing. So if we count gonadotrophic releasing hormone being produced on day 1 of a woman's cycle, FSH is then stimulated. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the development of the follicle. So it will take about maybe 14 days or so of a woman's cycle for estrogen levels to be high enough so that they will stimulate the pituitary gland to release luteinizing hormone. And then once the pituitary gland releases luteinizing hormone is going to go to the ovary and promote ovulation. And so it is that spike in luteinizing hormone that reaches the ovary that actually promotes ovulation. So notice in graphs B and D that LH levels are peaking in response to high levels of estrogen. And so now the follicle is gone, because remember I told you the follicle is like a little blister with the egg inside. Now the blister has popped and the egg has been released. And so now the follicle is gone, but instead now we have something called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is like a little scar tissue. And the corpus luteum is going to also produce hormones. And in this case, the corpus luteum is not going to produce estrogen. It's going to produce both estrogen in small amounts, but progesterone in much larger amounts. So now progesterone levels are going to go up, and estrogen levels will also then go up a little bit, because the corpus luteum will produce both estrogen and progesterone. And the corpus luteum is like a little scar tissue that forms where the follicle used to be. Now the egg has been released, ovulation is done, and both progesterone and estrogen together are going to go to the uterus and in this case maintain it. They're going to maintain that endometrium in preparation for fertilization. An egg has just been produced, ovulation has happened. The body's preparing for pregnancy now. So fertilization might still occur. The uterine lining needs to be maintained. Now, progesterone and estrogen levels are now going to continue to increase. And again, so let's think about it. So let's say we're in a 28-day cycle. Ovulation has occurred in day 14. So now over the next 14 days, progesterone and estrogen levels are going to increase. When progesterone and estrogen levels get high enough, then they're not going to stimulate hormone production, but they're going to inhibit it. And so both progesterone and estrogen together inhibit production of luteinizing hormone by the pituitary gland. They also inhibit FSH production and GnRH production. Without luteinizing hormone, the corpus luteum disappears, because the only reason that the corpus luteum was maintained is because luteinizing hormones was present. Without a corpus luteum, progesterone and estrogen levels are no longer going to be high because the corpus luteum was producing progesterone and estrogen. So when we lose progesterone, menstruation happens. And so now we are back at day 1 of the cycle with the stimulation of FSH by GnRH. And so the cycle continues. And that's it for today's lesson. I'll talk to you soon.